So we just took a deep dive by subjecting one particular study to scrutiny, and it was hopefully instructive because we saw a clear distinction between the modeling decisions and assumptions of the connectionist modeler, the modeling decisions and constructive work by the developmental psychologist, and the remove of both of those from the life world of the infant. So I'm going to carry on with this theme now, and we're going to just contrast two specific research projects. One is not a connectionist modeling project, but it gives you an idea of how else one might approach rich questions of infant development. And the other one is a target that has been attempted many times by connectionist modelers. The underlying data come from young children's acquisition of the English past tense, and there were many such models in the 1990s. So the first model we want to talk about is the Human Speech-Own project. This was a project done by Deb Roy, seen in the picture there, of MIT Media Lab. And at the time that his wife was pregnant with their first child, they decided to embark upon a remarkably ambitious project that required retrofitting their entire house, turning it into an observation station, putting overhead video cameras in every room with fisheye lenses, microphones in the walls, a lot of switches that had to be present in order to delete undesired data or to censor privacy concerns. The goal was to capture, as far as possible, the entire linguistic output on the one hand and environment on the other of a child over a period of 3 years, in that critical period when they're learning language like nobody's business. This generated an awful lot of data. The recordings were done between 2005 and 2008. Ancient history now. In those days, 200 gigabytes of data per day was an unimaginable amount of data. The basement of the house had to be retrofitted and turned into a data center to which all this data could be streamed. And then they ended up with 140,000 hours of audiovisual data, and making any kind of sense of that is extremely difficult. So a lot of the concerns that arose from a pragmatic point of view in this project have to do with how do you make intelligent use of this kind of rich data. There's an example of a view from one of these cameras. In this case, we're in the kitchen looking down on Deb himself, who is attending his son, who's in the high chair. Exploitation of this data set is still not complete. The data doesn't tell you how to look at it, so there's many, many ways one can approach this. One of the first things to be extracted from this data set was to find ways of going through and pick out individual pronunciations of a specific word, in this case water, so that you could place them back to back and you could follow the development of the word water and listen to it as the form changes over time. So the child's first productions where water was the intended sense were gaga. Caregivers are used to this. Children have idiosyncratic words for things and they grow out of it. But in this case, we can actually listen to the development from gaga to the more or less completed form of water in real time. So just have a listen to this. He gets there in the end. It takes him a while. And those vocal productions, of course, did not happen consecutively in time, but they've been assembled here. So you've got an artificial way of viewing the developmental process over time, comparable perhaps to watching a time-lapse video of something like the blooming of a flower. Now, that was just audio data. the video and audio captured together allow rich audio-visual sampling, and so we can do something similar here for the word ball. Now, there was no obvious development in the word ball there, but you begin to get a sense that there's not more recorded here than words. We tend to think of words as abstract things that don't exist anywhere, but each utterance here occurs in a particular place, at a particular time, in a particular context, and those are all recorded as well, allowing for a form of questioning which was really quite novel. Here's one of the first experimental results from this project, and it requires a little explanation. So we just watched the development of the word water and some sampling of the word ball. Now, each word could be understood to have its birthday. Its birthday is the day that the word is first produced by the child, regardless of whether it's an accurate production or not. And one can identify, for a large set of words, one can identify the birthday for each word. They're all on different days, of course. The child first produces truck on a different day from he first produces bread. But one can look then at sentences containing that word prior to the birthday and after the birthday. And there's a simple measure employed here, a mean length of utterance measure, which reflects the complexity of sentences containing this word in the period before the birth of the word and in the period after the birth of the word. Now we can plot those by aligning the birthdays all together, remembering that each word has a birthday on a different day. Nevertheless, this allows us to see commonalities in the complexity of sentences containing a word about to be birthed or that has just been birthed. And rather staggeringly, you can see from the data there that there is indeed a temporal trajectory here, and that in the months preceding the birth of the word, utterances from caregivers simplify, and they reach a maximum of simplicity around the time the child produces the word, and then they get more complex again. Now, this is happening on a different time scale for each word individually. This is not something anybody could ever remotely be conscious of. This, however, does clearly illustrate that there is a sensitive dance between the capacities of the child and the environment in which the child exists, and that the caregiver is responding reciprocally to the abilities of the child in real time in a way that nobody could be conscious of. If you have any knowledge of child development, this is a graphic illustration of Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development, where capacities first appear in an interpersonal space, often with the scaffolding of the caregivers, and only later become something that can become internalized and be part of the repertoire of the child itself. So, the Human Speechome Project allows a very direct observation of the linguistic environment of the child, and it's very relevant to many deep theoretical questions that were going around at the time and still persist today. So in the 1960s, Noam Chomsky had made some very, very important arguments about language, asserting that children must be born with, that it must have an innate readiness for language, because the language that they are exposed to in their environment is just too shoddy, poor, ill-formed to form the basis for learning something as complex as a grammar. This is known as the poverty of the stimulus argument, and it has had knock-on effects in all kinds of areas, including philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, has affected educators' view of how we learn languages and so on. Interestingly, nobody looked. This was the first experiment in which the linguistic output linguistic environment of a developing child was actually captured and analysed, and what it revealed was something far more complex and nuanced. This kind of armchair pronouncement doesn't really survive the empirical test. So that's the Human Speech Own project. That's the first of the two developmental research agendas we're going to look at. The next one will have to do with learning the past tense.